Well, I probably would begin with the myth that the black community has never had economic strength. That one of the things that came out of segregation, I remember having a conversation with Thomas Bowles, better known as Beans Bowles, who was with Motown. And I remember while I was doing the research, he made the remark to me that segregation was good for us and that we have never recovered from integration. And I thought that that was an interesting point, but it was correct. The way that Mr. Jackson and others would be able to come by and become a cornerstone in a community was because of segregation. You had supply and demand. You had a lot of black folks were there, and they needed the very essentials that most communities need. They needed good housing. They need to be able to maintain those houses. They needed employment. They need social relationships. All of that took place in Black Bottom. So much so that there was another great Motown musicians, and these musicians were jazzmen. And back in the day, jazzmen were much more than simply entertainers. They were historians. And Earl Van Dyke was the one that was pointing out to me that talked about Ben Turbin, the old police officer, but he talked about the social norms, but also the economic norms. Again, you had black men who were independent, like Mr. Jackson and others that would come into the community. They ran legitimate businesses, but sometimes they also ran like the numbers business, which was legitimate for the little guy. And I think America forgets about the little guy. And so there's the little guy in the black community as there's a little guy in the white community, the common man. So those people would go out and work. You have to understand the wonderful whole notion of numbers. Today, the hypocrisy talks about draining dollars and more from residents. But the numbers really was designed specifically for that working class family, working class guy that could put away even a penny, 5 pennies, a nickel, a dime, and maybe a quarter. And when it paid well. So it was more of a supplement. Nobody was going to hit the lotto. They understood what the game meant. But it was controlled by blacks until you started having organized white crime start to intercept, intervene, or simply try to gangster them out. So when you looked at Black Bottom, you looked at musicians, but you also looked at more. You had a spirit of great entertainment that Beans and Earl Van Dyke said you would go out if you were Caucasian, you would party in other parts of Detroit. But after midnight, if you really wanted to have a party, you really wanted to eat good, you came down to Black Bottom. And the senselessness of crime didn't exist. They weren't going to rob you, they enjoyed you. As a matter of fact, in the 50s, we had a great quarterback, Bobby Lane, who I think was the last time he took the Lions to a championship. But Bobby Lane used to come into Black Bottom and party because that's where the action was. That's where the good time was. That's where the best music was. Of course, we called that race music, and we made other excuses and tried to tag it. And then you come along and you look at what those number men did, those old, what you would say, gangsters would do. They gave money to the church. If you had orphans, they quietly, they didn't take out a marquee and say, look what I'm doing. They quietly gave money, they gave food. Now, I'm not trying to support what they did as the numbers racket, but what I am saying is that they had more than one hat that they wore, and the economics would thrive, and also for our black professionals.
And there wasn't a lot of violence.
There was no violence. There was literally no, the violence that came in from the outside. But you also cannot ignore that you had a very strong, it created a black upper class, but it also created a black middle class. So you had school teachers, you had lawyers, dentists. People were eating in the same spot. You may have to save more money if you were a little guy, but you saw all these good things going on around you. And you had doctors. Who were their clients? It was the working class people in Black Bottom. So Black Bottom was a spiritual, a social enactment, more simply than just economics. It all balanced out very well, and then suddenly it got blown up.
Okay, now, let's go.
Well, I think that the audience needs to understand the significance of black entrepreneurship that was not considered simply a doctor or a dentist, that there were businessmen. You even had Great Lakes Supreme Insurance Company. You did have black businesses that were thriving and doing well. But I don't think you can ignore the social levees that broke in '67. I mean, they were coming all along. But once that riot broke, then the social norms and the parameters changed immensely. So when this took place and you started talking about, this city was more like a big country town. It was not simply, when I say that, crime was not shoot 'em up, bang, bang, as it was in Chicago and New York, and you have black gangsters. The gangsters here had been a different type. We had almost a harmonious existence. You could walk around drunk and not get rolled on 12th Street or in Black Bottom. Again, I repeat that Black Bottom was very safe. When you did have conflict, it was over on the side. But overall, a lot of your professional athletes, black and white, again, Black Bottom was known for, this is where you go to have a great time. Now, you also had your red light district, so there was a great hypocrisy also, because you had strong prostitution. So I'm speaking of white businessmen, white factory workers and others would come over to the house of ill repute in Black Bottom. But once that came about, it was turned up, I would say, or broken up was a better term. When it was broken up, everything moved over to 12th Street. And you had the Chit Chat Lounge. Pimps was what was going on. And I always laugh about pimps because you talk about opportunities. Our decisions as what we were going to do as young black men were pretty clear. Either you were going to be an athlete, you finished high school, a few were going to college. Most of the young men in this city at one point were going to the factories. Many of them were lying, saying that they were pimps. They could buy, because they worked in the plant, they would buy them a Buick or a Cadillac, and they lied, talking about how they were great pimps and they had all these women, when the reality was that they were factory workers. But then you had another side of young men who were hustling, and it was very glamorous that you started knowing some of them who turned to drugs, Texas Slim, Monkey D. There were these names of guys who also hung out with the very stylish and important men who were part of Berry Gordy's Motown. So you're looking at Holland Dozier Holland. Those were young men writing songs, making money. So you had this whole image of cool that had changed. Some were wearing conked hair. They were driving Cadillacs, big cars. This is the Motor City. So cars were really important. And your clothing, how you dressed. If you were a player, that was a term that was thrown out, if you were truly a player. So I think that some men captured the fact that being a pimp wasn't all that it was said to be, the hard work. And then, in particular with Vietnam, we begin to have the infusion of drugs for the first time seriously. Now, in my research, we go back to the 50s and found out that heroin was there. You start talking about Henry Marzette, who was a police officer and then became the man in drugs. But he wasn't the only one. But the fact was that it still was hard to get into because organized crime was controlling those drugs. And so young men went from wanting to be a pimp, suddenly you had this drug dealer. And the drug dealer is the first time that we begin to see money that was well beyond pimps. You started seeing a different type of young black man. You started seeing Mercedes-Benzes. You started seeing a Rolls-Royce occasionally. You started seeing sport cars. But more importantly, the Black Power movement that came about, say, 67, 68. So pimping was also frowned upon. The movement was not allowing people to pimp women. Also, young black women were hearing parts of women's liberation. They may go out and be a hoe, but they wanted to be an independent hoe. They didn't want to be under a pimp. So a pimp suddenly became just out. You had Superfly was a good example of it. You remember in the movie, and for those who have not seen it, they should. Superfly is not the greatest movie, but symbolically, you had a point where the young man who played Priest, he went from the transition of being a pimp, and he brought about this new game. And he actually ran into a pimp, which was a real New York pimp in the movie. And the pimp was saying, I'm having all these trouble with my hoes in my stable. And Priest was looking at him with his partner like, that's silly. You run around here talking about, you want to make real money. And I think that was the significance. Drug money was the first time that the black gangster or the black hustler, and there's a difference in my opinion, was seeing real money. And I'm talking about big money. And so he made a transformation. And Superfly as a movie showed those young men. They weren't clowns, even they tried to make like Superfly was a clown, but he was a thinker. And I think that's what you saw, a thinker minus the violence, temporarily anyway. When I say that, he knew how to move his kilos, he knew about connections. For the first time, we were seeing young black men with an option of, you can do this, not be on Wall Street, but you can do this and be a thinker. And that was very different. A pimp was, well, we had these romantic views of a pimp, but at the end of the day, he had to beat up a woman, exploit a woman to get his money. But a hustler now could move drugs, and out of that drug money, then he moved into other areas, that he may buy property, he might set up a shop. It's a very complex subject, I would say, but it is a time that was, I think, revolutionary. And then you begin to have guys, speaking of the revolutionary, Black Panthers and others, were going after drug dealers, but they also were going after pimps. They were supposed to have been like our social street police, but it really wasn't like that, because a lot of the guys who were doing drugs, they had their muscle. They began to be organized quite well. They weren't punks. They weren't clowns. Some of the guys started driving Volkswagens. All of them were doing things. They also started intermingling. This should be a subject for you as a producer when you were at Wayne State. They started messing with a different breed of young women. They weren't just going for little girls that were out there doing the hoochie. They started getting college co-eds. What these men represent was a new way of entrepreneurship and also what you did with that money. They're the ones that started showing up at the fights that were Ali and Frazier. They were the ones that were traveling for the first time. We never saw that before. You're talking about traveling. You get in your Cadillac and go to Chicago. You get in your Cadillac, go to Alabama. But suddenly these young men that had drug money, and it spread very quickly, the girl like, oh, I want to get with, Eddie or whoever, because they're going down to the Bahamas. Or some of them were talking about going overseas. They were really just a whole new frame of thinking that the black community had not seen before. And a lot of them were not drug users, and that's important, because traditional black Southern values said that do not mingle with musicians because they were hopheads, they were drug addicts. But the pimp, a lot of the pimps, they might drink the best liquor, or like Superfly, he did the very best cocaine with his little fingernail. But overall, they were not drug users. And I think that's a difference. And I think that overall, many fought that image. It was okay for us to be, even as a researcher. When I talk about drug addiction as junkies, yeah, we can see that, Taylor. But when I begin to start talking about black organized crime or individuals that had entrepreneurship or were businessmen who didn't use drugs, who were drinking milk or the best whiskey and dressed well, all this clown stuff that even the attire in the movie New Jack City were selling drugs, were wearing Armani. They were not wearing big red hats and clowns with Cadillacs. They were driving like the kid with Butch Jones, Wonderful Wayne. They were driving a 600 Mercedes-Benz. A lot of people didn't know what a 600 Mercedes-Benz was. They started having Porsches and other cars. Now, there was a behavior, and I certainly don't want to paint a picture that they were just all wonderful and intelligent. Not the case. But there was a variation of something that we had not seen in my lifetime. This was the new day, that these new men came on the scene and they were doing cutthroat business, but they were businessmen, no different than Al Capone and company doing Prohibition. That was the new day that was ushered in, and that was the day that was, you got to remember, when you had the BKs and others, you might have one gun, you had a lot of zip guns. So the game changed in more than one way. You saw more money, you started seeing automatic weapons, you started seeing travel. I remember being, those who don't know, I had a security company, and I had Tommy Hearns as security. When we were in Las Vegas, the guys in YBI did come to the fight, and other players from Detroit. I'm talking about men who were rolling and no one knew who they were, really. They just saw them as businessmen. You look at them, some of those men had record shops, some of them had clothing stores. A lot of people didn't know that they were in the drug game. People would whisper, but they were very, I would say, they were very discreet, they were very intelligent, and very serious. I mean, if you were smart, you'd catch on real quick, like, well, something's going on. But they weren't advertising that they were into selling illicit narcotics. So it was just almost, I don't want to say a renaissance, but it was very different from the traditional black crime that we had seen back in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. It began to evolve in the 60s, and by the 70s and 80s, we had a new player on the ground. Well, I didn't, and I certainly wouldn't want to be on camera saying that I knew Eddie Jackson. I ran a security company, and I knew that he was allegedly a backer of some concerts. That he was, which was collectively some other men also that were in street life, and that they were investors. So when they came to the concerts, you knew as security that that wasn't the guy that you were going to frisk, that wasn't the guy that you told wait over there, that there was a sense of this is a man of power. He wasn't the only one, but they would show up well-dressed, fur coats.
Carry themselves.
Always very matter of fact. Didn't have a lot of time for nonsense. Never a problem because the concerts or the businesses that they were backing, they came there on business, which would be true of other groups, whether they were Mexican or Arab or other businessmen. You just understood clearly who the business guys were opposed to the guys who were out fronting that they were pimps or players. There was an air about them. So you would see Mr. Jackson. I saw him on more than one occasion. He'd speak. He didn't have no time for you. You know what I mean? He's just like, hey, what's going on? It was very different. He was not a hoodlum. The guys that we get at concerts that we'd have to check with security, he was there about his business. And you saw the entertainers intermixing with them. But from where I sat, he was one of several men that was about serious business. He belonged to that same group that Henry Marzette, that when I saw him when I was younger, there was a small collective body of these businessmen. And so you didn't know whether they were numbers. And where I come from, honestly, people be fronting, that wasn't none of my business. You didn't go sticking your nose into Mr. Jackson's business or anyone else. You see them at the concert. They usually had gorgeous women with them, well-dressed. They were players, and they were also part of urban legend. There would be a lot of younger guys looking at them, and I watched that as a researcher. They would watch who Eddie Jackson, they wanted to see what he was wearing. If he wore a certain style, even if they couldn't afford it, it's kind of like the Nike commercials with Michael Jordan, be like Mike. They wanted to be like that gangster, and he was the man, and it wasn't a lot of puffing up. I never even saw anything remotely close to violence because those guys were too smart. They didn't do anything violent. You knew if you crossed them, and sometimes you would hear a blow up backstage, but they always conducted their business in a business-like way. So that would be pretty much it.
Okay, now, things going on.
Well, I think that at that time, and again, you have to be careful because people will accuse me of glorifying, and in particular that I'm a scholar. I'm not there to glorify, but it was a time of wine, women, and song. The entertainers wanted to take pictures with the likes of those men, like Eddie Jackson. So you'd see the OJs and the beautiful, like Phyllis Hyman. They were the ones that would go to the little private parties after a concert, and those men were an elite group. The interesting thing is I toured the nation. I saw those same types of men in many cities, whether it was Philadelphia or Baltimore or Washington, D.C. You see the same, you see the Eddie Jacksons and those types of men in other cities. And ironically, sometimes you would even look up and there would be Eddie Jackson or some of those other men. And it was like a little club that they had, and they would greet them and they would treat them like royalty. That's really what would happen. I remember, bless him, he's passed now, W.G. Garrison down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And when we got down there, because they treat security like dogs. That's nothing bad. It's just that, you're the muscle and that's it, and you do what you do. You attack dog. But Garrison would always be good because I'm a big guy, and he's like, yeah, you hungry, boy? Yeah, come on in here and get some real Baton Rouge, the different treats. We were in New Orleans the same way. So a lot of times those guys would show up, Mr. Jackson, I'd see other guys who were in the life, who were major players in other cities, and vice versa. I remember the guys from St. Louis. And many times it was connected, not saying anything bad about Al Perkins, but Al Perkins was a player. I thought, and he was, he controlled the radio station, and he also was managing, I believe, One Way or something. He had groups. And so when Al Perkins showed up in St. Louis, he was treated like royalty along with Mr. Jackson. And there'll always be a few guys. I think everyone that was in the business, entertainment business, knew who those men were. So they would take pictures with their kids. They were just treated special. I think that it would be misleading to say that probably to their children, about their children probably really didn't have any depth or understanding, especially when they were real young, that outside of that, my dad's important. My dad is very important. And quite frankly, a lot of times you'd have politicians speak to them. People would be careful about who they took their pictures with. I think that when we went to Las Vegas, and Emanuel Stewart and Prentice Byrd certainly were gentlemen and had worked hard, but when they got there, they also, I would say that men who were major players, entertainers, people who were in street life, would come again to see Tommy. Tommy was, when we fought Ray Leonard, well, when Thomas, I didn't fight, but when Thomas fought Ray Leonard, it was almost like a religious gathering. Everybody came by to see Tommy. Sometimes I would laugh as a security guy, and I'd be like, whoa. I remember Jesse Jackson said, Jesse was over here with us, but then I looked around, he's over there with Ray Leonard, and Ray was the enemy for us at that time when they were fighting for the world, to consolidate the championship. But you see Jim Brown, and again, you see those same men, those men who were separate and different. Those same men that were players like Eddie Jackson, you didn't have to know specifically, but you knew damn well that when they showed up, they got into the VIP room. And so we'd have to let all our guys know that. Now, there were some, and I'm not saying Mr. Jackson, but there were some of those men who had their own Lou Gabrowskis with them. They had their own muscle with them. And most of the time, those men were fierce looking. They were, but they didn't do anything. They were just there kind of like insurance. And I took it as like politicians or kings of nations. They had their army with them. They have 2 or 3 guys. And so you would get to know them, and it was always straight. And I would say that having a lot of interaction on national tours, and then Detroit was my house. I was the resident security for Joe Louis and Coble. Matter of fact, my company opened up Joe Louis Arena. So you would see them. What was different, I think, over a period of time, you begin to see politicians, black politicians, intermingling with people. And I'm not suggesting that there was any conspiracies, but what you begin to see was just simply power brokers. And I think that there's a myth in society that these are the bad people and these are the good people. And that's a lark. That really is. It's very powerful. You need to understand. And I think those children, many times I never had it with Mr. Jackson, but I've had other men who were of power come in with their kids and demand that we take care of their kids the same as a politician. So I won't name any politicians that at that time, but it could be a black state rep, a black state senator. There would be someone from the mayor's office. Those children would all be placed in a very safe place. Their fathers, for the most part, were, people may be surprised, relatively conservative. In other words, they didn't want their kids hearing any cursing, any hootie, I call it hootie-hoo, any behavior that wasn't coming. They were very protective of their families. So the little kids essentially many times were brats. They were very smart kids. They went to private schools, and they were little brats, and you had to take care of them. So that was the difference, whereas back in the day, the gangs, a lot of the, you started talking about black killers and the BKs. We weren't dealing with that type of interaction. That was a whole different scene.
Do you think that is, you don't have that mixture now in the black community?
No.
The street stuff is totally separate. Well, or what's your comment on it, Jim?
Well, I think what we're seeing now in the streets is very different, but I think in fairness, what I see in my college classroom is very different. that youth culture is very different today. What I'm seeing is an intermingling of different groups, ethnic groups. I'm seeing people don't want to hear this, but I'm seeing Latinos mixing with African American and Arabs and Asians and others. And so you have a intermix that we didn't see 30 years ago, but also you do see a mixing of class when you ask that question. I see more middle class kids involved with lower class kids and even upper class kids in terms of thinking that they're entitled, that they're flexing, like I'm the one, which is very different. That younger kid, when you looked at Jackson and that time Marzette, those kids were much more disciplined and much more separated from what was going on in terms of business. This kid today, a lot of these kids are fronting, and they're like they really push the envelope in a different way. And so, for example, now I have young Caucasian males in my classes saying to me, like one day a kid I came to the podium and he was early, he was sitting there, and I said, "Good afternoon." He said, "What's up?" And I'm looking at him, he got the baseball hat back, and I'm like, "Where are you from?" And then I said, "I'm your professor." And he's like, yo, yeah, that's straight. I heard of. And I'm looking, I'm like, where are you from? And he said, "I'm from Bloomfield Hills." And then I'm like, "Well, do your parents know you speak like that?" And people should recognize even a word that we weren't allowed, because I come from that black Southern tradition. My mother, the F word was funky. We could not curse. We could not say, huh. So if you said, huh, you got checked. I now have Caucasians and Asian and other university students ask them something, they say, huh? And that is not a word we use in the university, you understand? So there's been an intermixing that we did not see. Race has been an issue always, but so has class. And now it seems that both of those are marginalized and not the same as they were 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, and then feelings about that contention or that?
Well, my positive side is that this marginalized relationship historically has been very different than what it's no different than all of America, but for some reason those who report the history have always left the blacks on the plantation, even in those type of activities. I don't see a great deal of difference, except that Kennedy was making a lot more money. Joseph Kennedy became an ambassador. Eddie Jackson didn't become an ambassador. But the difference is that the similarities are very similar, that we use crime as a commodity in terms of economics. So whether you're selling corn or bootlegging liquor or selling heroin, and I'm talking about the damage that it does to people now. I'm speaking of the commodity, the business side of it. I don't see a difference. But what I do see, even as a researcher, that people are very uncomfortable, many in history, that want to always say that there's no such thing as organized black crime, or that we didn't have serious gangsters or players in the business of crime. So, you ask yourself questions like tobacco. How many people died last year from tobacco? When we started talking about the moral value of what Eddie Jackson and others do. I'm not condoning what they do. What I'm simply saying is that there are many on that playing field. And so when we demonize one group and then another group, we just kind of smile and look the other way. So there is a significant similarity between, and I don't mean to pick on the Kennedys, and the Kennedys have made a great contribution. The jury is still out. We don't know what's going to happen to the African American families that were involved with serious crime and their children, because I would tell you that I see them in my classroom. So much so that I recently had one, I certainly won't name her on the air, but she had no idea that her uncle was a major player. When I looked at the names, whoa, I know you, and she said, that's my uncle, and but your uncle was a major player. And she says, well, so I heard. She's just like any other little middle class, upper middle class kid from the burb. A lot of these children don't know anything historically, really, experience-wise, about growing up, quote, in the hood. They have been homogenized, and they are suburbanites. And so we don't know what they're going to do. But I will tell you that I know of several who are doing quite well legally. I think it's a lot like the movie that Paul Newman was in one time, and we don't recognize it. I forget the name of it, but his father was a gangster, but he chose to be just a regular, everyday guy. He had a very difficult time doing that. And I think some of these children, unfortunately, because of their namesakes, will be judged by the media and others. And we don't, for example, we rarely ever look at preachers in the community, that there's a relationship between number of men and a lot of the old pastors. And again, I'm not condemning the church, but the pastor knew if he needed big money, if someone's home burned down, and in those days we weren't talking insurance, you didn't go to the bank, you didn't go to these other community places that Caucasians would go to. That preacher knew he had to go to the number man or the gangster. And it might be that the guy who was in Prohibition. For all I know, it may have been the guy that was selling heroin or crack or cocaine. We as Americans always want to be very romantic about things, but I think that they share in common before we throw stones at them and become hypocrites. You have to realize that this is about economics. This is about capitalism. And this is about a type of capitalism that many poor blacks could not go anywhere but to that guy in black bottom who had came up from the South. Even if you look at the legacy of Berry Gordy Sr., Pops was known as a jack of all trades. He was quite an entrepreneur. And I'm not suggesting at all, I wouldn't want to get sued by the Gordys, but they were a hard-working family, and a lot of those hard-working families also gave out loans. And if you got a hold of it in the media, many times you would say, well, they were loan sharking. No, they weren't. They were just doing business like everybody else. And the same thing could be said, because you have Bernstein here to talk about organized crime on that other side. But the same thing could be said about many of those men also, that they would help out the widow. They really would. They turn around and do their business, and that business could be bloody sometimes. So not to romanticize it, but I think that the African-American community has quite a debt parallel to what we would consider a criminal enterprise. And we have to be careful with that again. But they owe quite a debt that a lot of people, including myself, I have to say that at one point I was given money as a young man on Washington Boulevard by Henry Marzette. He was in Citrons. A lot of the young ones would know, Sconix, I'm sorry. Sconix was a store where all the players were. And I had an uncle who was a major player. And I was bedazzled by Marzette. He was wearing house shoes. He had a black Fleetwood, 1965, he had a black Fleetwood Cadillac that I thought was the coolest car in the world. And he gave me money for school. And that's what he said. The money wasn't for me to go and get clever in an Italian knit. He gave me that money and he said, and I expect for you to go and use this for school and nothing else. So, and also when I came back as a freshman, in 1967, 68, and I went to an after-hour joint because I needed to. I wasn't adjusting to MSU in that first time really well. I was marched out of the after-hour joint by the doorman under the orders of the old gangster. And before they kicked me out, he told me, we sent you away to school. We don't want to see your little ass in here no more. You don't come back here. So there's also that protectiveness that people rarely ever talk about. There's a lot of good that they did. Now maybe their conscience was bothering them, maybe because they came from that old black Southern Christian tradition, I don't know. But there was not like a lot of the players today. A lot of players today don't care. You know, if you can help them get it on, let's get this on. Back in the day, including Eddie Jackson's crew, those guys would not just take anybody. They would not. They were very disciplined about, you can't come over here, your little young ass out. And I think that's an important part, which is no different than the old Italian gangsters and others, you know. Older men knew that some kids were set, they should stay over here in the normal life, and then some kids could come over here and they get into the life. There was a pecking order. There's not a pecking order today, in my opinion. And that's the danger of it, that a young guy who comes in today, he wants to be Eddie Jackson, because he decided he wanted to be Eddie Jackson. He's not willing to do an apprenticeship. He's not willing to run the grunt duty and so forth. And I think that's plaguing organized crime across the board. And I don't think it's just one community, that there's no trust. I just left some young men earlier today, 3 of them, and they were supposed to have been friends. And one of them was in the back seat and the other 2 in the front. The one in the back seat took the other two, shot them. One died, one didn't. You didn't see that back in the day. Not like that, you know, just easily. These guys, they have no loyalty. The last thing I would say is that one of the main contributors to my research earlier was Vincent Passante, who was a former police officer, well, he was a chief of detectives before he headed up organized crime for the state of Michigan. And he shared the story with me about Henry Marzette, who was on his deathbed. And Marzette said to him, and he was speaking of the young men of this Young Boys Incorporated mindset, that he said on his deathbed that he could do business with everybody, but he could not do business with this young boy. And I think that was a prophecy. I think it was very strong, and I respect a great deal of what Vincent Passante, I think he's one of the great experts on organized crime in Detroit. So I think that he gave us insight that we are living and suffering for today. They go after college girls, different girls as a trophy. They don't want hoochie mama. Well, the difference in our community, though, I would point out that the difference was that back in the day when I was coming up, our girls were taught not to even socialize with someone from the street. They didn't, matter of fact, our restrictions were so rigid that even if a guy had his hair conked, my sister couldn't even talk to him. My mother, what are you doing? Let me catch you with a slick head. You know what I mean? They just went out. So it was taboo. So you didn't have to worry.